emergence is those are the questions. Yeah. So I'm going to give a little bit of a history of emergence, and then I'm going to explain why I think it's kind of misconceived. I'm going to conclude that it is an important concept and it's often misunderstood for various reasons. So that's just a quote I like. Ontological surprises is what we're talking about, things coming to be that weren't there before and weren't expected given what was there before. It's a surprise. Many things are surprising, including life. So emergentism, I think John Stuart Mill was one of the first people to start talking about it, but he didn't really use the word. But it was around sort of the late 19th, early 20th century when you know, there was lots of changes in the way people saw the world. Dualism was going out of fashion. Everyone was trying to be scientific, and so they were trying to figure out how these complex things like life, but also other things like so. Emergentism was a kind of, admittedly, hand-wavy answer to that question. So things emerge from a substrate, but they're not reducible to it, they're not explainable to it. So they came up with the idea that there were necessary connections between these things, but those connections were in the form of brute laws. Brute meaning that they're not explanatory, they don't explain anything, they're just like a correlation between a lower level phenomenon and a higher level one. Don't read too much into the talk of levels, really. One of the problems that we'll see with this debate is it's very easy to fall back into kind of dualistic ways of talking. So when I say between levels, I'm not talking about anything non-physical. I'm just talking about different levels of description, explanation, things like that. Emergentism went out of fashion when we found explanations. So it's rather like the story of the life force. Why are there living things? There must be a special life force to explain it. No one really disproved that theory. It's just that over time we found we no longer needed it to explain anything. There was nothing left to explain. We know how living things work. We know how to get energy from the environment and to do things with. So mysteries disappear as we find explanations, and we find we no longer need to talk about emergence in those cases. But in the case of minds or conscious beings, which we might be able to talk about what we mean by that, if you like. I'm just taking everyday understanding at the moment. Then we still don't have an explanation of it. So emergentism is sometimes used, sometimes lazily, to just say, it must emerge from the complexity of the brain, or something like that. So it can be problematic because emergentism then it's not a good argumentative strategy. Just use it to fill gaps in your knowledge. Say it emerged, right? That's rather like people the idea of the God of the gaps. It's just the things that we can't explain. We say, oh, well, that's proof of God. So typically, when people talk about emergentism, then in order to distinguish that kind of hand-wavy, mysterious version from a more substantial version, people distinguish between weak and strong emergence. So weak emergence is epistemic in that it's not really so much about the world as how we view the world and our understanding of the world. It's epistemic in that, so for example, in phenomena like bird flocking, murmurations of starlings, things like that, you get these complex patterns that we can see, but those patterns just emerge weakly from very simple rules interacting over time, and you get these patterns that come out of that. So you can simulate that from initial conditions. You can come up with simulation of voids, you know, with the little rules of flocking behavior, and you get these nice patterns emerging, and it's really lovely. So lots of things are like that, weakly emergent. So we call agent interactions, whereas the flocking behavior of a flock, there's no agent driving it. It just follows from the simple rules and the context, the constraints it's in. But obviously, when you start talking about agents with causal powers, things like that, that starts to smell a bit dualistic. Like there's something extra that comes into play in the world when we have brains, minds like ours. But again, it's kind of mysterious and not very satisfactory to talk like that. So strong emergence is often just dismissed as impossible by lots of people in the arguments, because it has this whiff of dualism. So really, it's not a dichotomy. There's only one horn to this dilemma. We don't want dualism. So it's either impossible or inadequate. And that's the reason why people are unsatisfied with the notion of emergence and think it doesn't really do much. So, you know, it's inadequate in that really, I think we do want to make causal generalizations about types of things in the world. Sciences do this in lots of different ways, biology included, where they talk about the types of agents in there, or the types of objects that they study, and they make causal regularities about them which they can use to predict things and explain. So we do want, I believe lots of people want something which can ground that kind of everyday scientific talk about things in the world about which we can make general causal statements. And that's what we need from a strong sense of emergence. Weak is too weak. We don't want the kind of mysterious, strong emergence. We want something else. So I think a lot of this debate is based on bad metaphysics, some outdated assumptions, like some dualist assumptions. That strong emergence must be dualistic. No one's a dualist, I assume, in this room. I've met some, but you know, I don't think we'll find any here. Or maybe there are some unwitting dualists, I don't know. We need to pay some attention to the metaphysics here, particularly of causation. So before I go back to emergence and sort of analyze the concept a bit more in detail, we need to do a bit of metaphysics about causation so that we're not using we're not grounding our thoughts on some misplaced assumptions here. So causation. How many people have thought a lot about causation? Good, yeah, okay. I mean, I think we all should, really, because we're interested in making causal generalizations as scientists. So it's important to think about it, because we can easily get misled if we have some wrong assumptions. So just a very quick history. Obviously, this isn't comprehensive, just to give ideas of different views that have been around. Aristotle, with his idea of substances in the world with causal power. About our epistemic access to the world. So he was interested really in kind of axiomatic ways of thinking that we can justify by reference to undoubtable principles like mathematical axioms. So he, instead of out there in the world that we can observe, talked about laws, which were kind of mathematical. So the thing about the laws is that laws have to be a relation between universals, and people often talk, and I hear scientists talking like this about laws as something out there that govern what happens in the world. There are universal laws, and the world has to follow those laws, and our job as scientists is to discover them. But if you think about it, that's really quite metaphysically problematic. This idea that there are these universal laws that exist in some kind of abstract Platonic way, which push things around. That's a lot of metaphysical assumptions there, of these principles which are causing things to happen in the world, abstract things somewhere. And then there's Hume, who's an empiricist. So he says that we can't see any causation, all we see is patterns of regularity, just one thing after another, and we just notice what tends to follow another thing, and we come up with these regularities, and that's what our scientific generalities are. So they're just three different pictures of the metaphysics of causation that we can have. Without going through a lot of argument here, the picture that I'm going to advocate is interventionist or manipulationist account, which is basically just, well, what would happen if we manipulated this, which is experimental technique, right? So we can say something causes something if thinking, you can ignore all and different things like that, whether we're talking about levels or wholes or parts of wholes. That doesn't really matter. We don't have to tie ourselves down to an assumption that causation has to be between this type of thing. Causation is just what we observe in the world when we change, when we intervene in the world. And that's how we discover what causal relations are. And this allows us, I think, to make statements at the right level of generality. So unlike the kind of assumption that everything has to be reduced down to the interaction of physical parts, this allows us to talk at a slightly more abstract level in a way that's justifiable. So the example used by Woodward is birds pecking. So if you notice that a bird pecks ruby spots and scarlet spots, crimson spots, you could say the bird's pecking is caused by ruby spots or scarlet spots or whatever. But really, the correct level to make that causal statement is to say that the bird is caused to peck by red spots, which includes, it's multiply realizable by all these different shades of red. We don't have to assume that the causation is going on at the lowest, most fundamental level. So that allows us, that same way of thinking allows us to talk about causal connections between multiply realizable things, like, for example, realized in multiple ways. And we can say that a mental state of that type causes this kind of behavior without having to go down to the details of exactly how it's instantiated each time in each token. We can talk about causation between types with this account of causation. And that's what we really want to do in our general statements, right? We want statements about kinds of things in the world. So we can also distinguish lots of different types of causation, not just simple one thing banging into another, but we can distinguish, and it makes a difference when we distinguish these between different types of processes, pathways, mechanisms, feedback loops, etc. I'll come back to the kind of hourglass and reentrant processes at the end, because I think that's what's important with emergence. So, talking about realization. So, lots of the anti-emergentist arguments talk about the realization base or the instantiation of things. So, we think about the realization of a mental state. We're talking about, just to simplify, in a brain. Most arguments against emergence would say the actual causal work is being done by the realization base and not by the mental state itself. Forget the mental state to talk about realization base. That's kind of Kim-style argument, to very simplify. So, but if we think about, and this is a couple of the questions in the warm-up, is the physical realization of something worth calling a mental state, is it a necessary condition for that mental state? Is it sufficient? Both? Neither. What are the options here? So if we think about the four options that are available, we can dismiss is neither necessary nor sufficient, because that's a kind of dualism, saying it's just something else, it's sui generis. Necessary and sufficient, so realization base for the higher level kind, and it's enough, doesn't need anything else. That's reductionism, that necessary and sufficient, a way of translating from one to the other. It's sufficient. If you say it's enough, it's not necessary because it could be realized in lots of different ways. That would be a kind of standard supervenience claim, which there's a lot to say about, but I'm not going to say it here. I think just to summarize, it's supervenience interpreted synchronically, as in the realization base at this time slice is too narrow. It basically ends up being a kind of reduction. We can broaden the supervenience base, but that's a complicated debate there. So I think what we should be saying really is that the realization base is necessary. But it's not sufficient because the lower level descriptions, the physical base, and they need something else. They need to be part of a context, an ongoing trajectory of development, that type of thing. There's lots of stuff that needs to be going on in the background and around and about in order for things like brains to have things like mental states. So putting all that together, contingent contextual conditions gives us contextual emergence. Together, the context, history, the trajectory through space and time, etc. Together with the realization base, they're jointly sufficient for the types of things that we are interested in. So emergence, becoming, takes time. It's a diachronic process. So the causal powers, they're causally productive because they are physically instantiated. They need to be physically to have any productive power, but they're explained by their trajectory. So this is kind of similar to what Paul Humphreys called flat emergence, and there are other versions like this. So really, when we're thinking about emergence, we shouldn't be thinking of something new, a new level on top, as it were, because that's kind of dualistic again, something above the physical. Really, we should be thinking of before and after in a process. Things emerge through this process. They don't pop up out of nowhere above. So rather like this is like a phase shift in physical material. There's a certain point at which you get changes happening, like from liquid to solid. That's phase shift. It happens over time, non-mysteriously. But this is where I think with the kind of creatures we're interested in, kind of reentrant structure. So, unlike ice crystal formation, which is a simple kind of emergence, and I'm pluralistic about emergence. One thing. There's lots of different things that we talk about. In the case of evolved beings like us, we're interested in things which emerge through time in what basically you can and things like that, and we can think about in terms of coarse messy. We want to make it smooth and simple. So coarse graining is smoothing out the noise, and that has the advantage of making something more robust to perturbations. So if you think about the realization of different humans, for example, each one is a very complex thing, but if you ignore the differences between them, then you can make a kind out of that rather than. It has the advantage of making something more robust to perturbations. So if you think about the realization of different humans, for example, each one is a very complex thing, but if you ignore the differences between them, then you can make a kind out of that rather than lots of separate ones. So we coarse grain when we simplify, categorize. That's what we're doing. We're ignoring the small differences between tokens of types and seeing them as members of this larger type. We're ignoring those little changes, little differences, and the noise. And evolution does that when it selects as well. It's ignoring the small differences. Obviously, those small differences sometimes make a big difference, and that's how evolution works. But coarse graining is a pervasive and important factor in the world, and it's behind the kind of emergence that we're talking about. So these systems, we can think of them, in the kind of way that Varela does, self-maintaining system, which is taking in energy from the environment in order to maintain itself in this far from equilibrium state, fighting against second law of dynamics. That's what living systems do, and the feedback dynamics and causal relations there are important to the whole thing. So we've got the feedback dynamics, reciprocal causation, reentrant structures through time. That's the kind of processes that we see, that we're interested in biological beings. So the mechanisms, and we can talk about mechanisms at lots of different levels, from when the egg is fertilized and then it goes on to create different structures, and the signaling telling different bits of DNA what to become. This is a hierarchical, diachronic, complex process built in layers, and there's lots of really interesting work to be done on understanding that process and how it comes about. That was what Turing was doing just before he died. He was going in that direction, thinking about how the structure of natural living things emerges naturally from the dynamics So we've got the DNA, we've got the developmental niche that we grow up, and that's the context, the constraints. And then, not just biological, we're also minded types of creatures, in that we have something like a brain, which is it has the right kind of structure, computational structure. I don't want to. I meant to put that in scare quotes. I'm not talking about digital computers. I'm just talking about information processing systems. In brains, they're highly flexible, and it allows virtual machines to come into existence. So there's biological machines, which are there from DNA, and virtual machines, which happen in neural structures. And that also relies on an environment that we pick up certain concepts in, for example. So that makes evolution possible, and minds emerge, and those minds, they're a kind of coarse graining by evolution and by cultural evolution. Also, it allows kind of minds that do coarse graining in their understanding of the world to emerge. And that's what we do as scientists, by trying to come up with generalizations about things in the world that we can make causal statements about that are true. And if we do find any things like that, then we have found emergent things. So emergent things are necessary for our understanding. Strong emergence, in that it's ontological, in that it's new things in the world with causal powers, actual physical causal powers, but they don't pop up, and the laws that connect them to their substrate aren't brute. They're not just correlational, they're explanatory, and that's important. They necessitate the types of things that come about. So it's not that there's a new fundamental type of thing that comes into existence when something emerges. It's not an underived thing. It doesn't pop out of anywhere. So we're concerned with things that emerge, and we can see why, and we can explain how they emerge by looking at their histories and their contexts. Considering the conditions for emergence in that way, in thinking about it, is important for informing us as engineers of artificial agents, given that agency itself is an emergent property. So that's why the shoehorn is quite relevant in this context. Okay, thank you.